Men all over the world are struggling with their mental health. Anxiety, depression, and suicide rates among men continue to rise. There are many underlying factors to these challenges that need to be addressed in order for meaningful change to happen. To help address these issues, we're focusing on men's mental health, and we'll be talking about some of the challenges men are experiencing. Welcome to Living Fully, a Calgary Counseling Centre podcast. Each episode, we'll bring you insights from our expert counselors and tips and strategies to improve your mental well-being. I'm your host, Katherine Hurtig. Calgary Counseling Centre and Counseling Alberta provide effective counseling for anyone in Alberta with no waitlist and no financial barriers. Find us online at calgarycounseling.com or counselingalberta.com. On this episode, I talk with Curtis Bader, registered psychologist, about the role that relationships of all kinds play in men's mental health and how men can build strong and healthy relationships. Thanks again, Curtis, for joining me today.
You're so welcome.
If you can just start out by introducing yourself and tell us a bit about your background.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Curtis. I'm a counselor at the Calgary Counseling Centre. I'm a registered psychologist, and I've been a full-time counselor for 2 years now.
Awesome. We're going to talk about men's mental health and particularly about how relationships play a role in mental health and, how to build those healthy relationships and how working on communication can improve men's relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I want to address the reason that we're talking specifically about men's mental health. And, I'm sure as a counselor, you can elaborate on this, but it's not unheard of that men are more hesitant to talk about their mental health. I mean, in Canada, suicide rates are about 3 times higher for men compared to women. So it's definitely an issue. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're exactly right that men are less likely than women to seek help for mental health, but it doesn't mean that they're struggling any less. And so it's important that we bring attention to the topic of men's mental health so that they recognize that it's important to reach out. It's important to seek help because it can be life-changing and even life-saving.
Right. Why is it that men are less likely to reach out for help if they're having a hard time?
It's a number of factors, I would say, but a lot of it is due to socialization. Kind of this idea that men are kind of taught that it's important that they just deal with their problems on their own, that they show a lot of strength and independence that way. So it's kind of discouraged to really seek help from other people or admit any sort of fallibility or any vulnerability. So it's not really socially acceptable to tell other people that you're struggling in that sense. So there's kind of this ingrained perspective that men have to be assertive and competent and independent, and that can kind of prevent them from seeking help.
I hope that we're moving away from that idea. I think it's so dangerous. I'm trying to be really conscious of that with my stepson and talk about all different kinds of emotions, make him feel okay to feel and express all different kinds of emotions. I think it's so dangerous to send that message that, that it's not okay.
Mm-hmm. I've even noticed that personally on sports teams I've played on, that when you try to engage men in conversations about how they're doing, how their family is, what they're struggling with, they really tend to divert it to, no, it's going good. It's fine. No problem.
Yeah.
So it's not a very comfortable topic for them to discuss as well.
Are there more common mental health challenges that men face that are, unique to them versus women? Does it show up differently, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think previous research kind of demonstrated that men tend to externalize their feelings and engage in behaviors such as drinking or dangerous behaviors or risky behaviors, whereas women tend to internalize their feelings, and it kind of leads to things like depression. But that research has been kind of called into question, suggesting that really it's not such a difference between men and women, that men struggle just as well with women about or similar types of things, but they maybe just express it differently or are conditioned to express it differently.
Okay.
You're right that men do make about 3/4 of suicide cases in Canada, and it's even higher among other minority ethnic groups. Men also struggle more with substance use. Again, about 75% of the cases are with men. But they also do struggle with things like depression, as well as neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. So these things are still occurring within men as well, even to higher degrees in some cases.
Mm-hmm. But it's just not talked about as much, or we're not seeing as much of them?
Yeah, what I was kind of reading about is that there might be a bias towards how this is presented. There could be measurement bias in how they're actually recording the data. Maybe men aren't presenting it or being honest about it in the surveys that are being conducted. Or maybe it's clinician bias. A lot of people will kind of assume that men will be struggling with a different type of issue, and they'll kind of just check boxes based on what they assume versus what's actually happening for the person.
Yeah.
And so really, like, their experiences of depression, for example, are at higher rates than previously documented, especially with the low help-seeking behavior. Not a lot of men actually come forward and acknowledge that they need the support, so it could be severely underestimated how men are actually suffering.
Does it show up differently in men? We've talked about the common signs of depression, the lethargy and, losing interest and, all these different things. Does it show up in the same way? Does it look different?
Yeah, men have lower rates of mild and moderate depression, but they do struggle with those kind of similar rates of severe depression. So things like you said, like kind of the loss of interest, the loss of pleasure, feelings of guilt, feelings of worthlessness, feelings that they can't really take care or help themselves, and that can lead to that.
Right.
But they do kind of present differently. And that's kind of what research has shown in the past, is that men tend to use things like alcohol or drugs to numb their distress. They tend to conceal or ignore negative emotions. So they kind of internalize how they're feeling. So they don't externalize it or tell others about it. They engage in more risky behaviors that could really worsen the stress. And
So what do you mean by risky behaviors?
Risky behaviors could be things that endanger themselves, or maybe like risky sexual behaviors, so having unprotected sex or having sex with multiple partners, or maybe they're engaging in more extreme sports or more extreme activities that could be dangerous, like cliff jumping or things like that just kind of gives a thrill or kind of gives a rush, or maybe helps distract them from how they're feeling or helps them to vent their feelings. Maybe they get into more fights, for example.
Okay, that makes sense. So we kind of touched on this, how, historically men have been kind of conditioned to suppress their emotions and, they have to appear strong and capable. So let's talk about how this expectation can impact their mental health.
I think the biggest thing, two major things really, is that kind of conception of masculinity being about strong, being independent, being self-reliant, that flies in the face of the fact that all of us struggle and all of us need help from other people. None of us are completely self-reliant, even down to things like, do you grow your own food, or do you fix your own toilets, or do you provide your own power? Very few people do all those things for themselves. So in many respects, we're asking help from other people, but we've kind of come up with this idea that we shouldn't have to, and yet we need to.
Yeah.
So that can lead to that internalization of just never discussing it, never bringing it up, never asking for support, just doing it yourself. And that can be so difficult and so dangerous. The other thing is that not only does it kind of isolate them from getting the help, but it makes them feel guilty, makes them feel worthless for not being able to help themselves. When, again, nobody can only help themselves. So it kind of doubles down on this perception that men are not fitting the bill when they can't help themselves. And so that leads to low help-seeking behavior too, where they don't feel like it's embarrassing now to go for help because now it's a slight on their manlyhood or their character. Totally. And, bridging off that, not only is it just personally maybe embarrassing to seek help if this is the expectation, but how would you be perceived by your peers? How would you be perceived by other people if they saw you asking for help? They might say, oh, what's wrong with him? He can't handle it. He can't tough it out. He's weak, or he's incompetent, or he's, some other kind of negative perception because they have reached out for help. Maybe, and especially I think in online spaces, we all try to kind of show our best self and our strongest self.
Yeah.
And so they might be kind of like trying to prove to others, but also to themselves, that I can hack this, I can handle this. I don't need to get the help. And really internally, they're like, actually, that fits me.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in your opinion, what do we do about this? How do we go about changing those viewpoints and, making the idea of being vulnerable and having these emotions be acceptable?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think there's a number of things that we can do to kind of help normalize this idea that all people, men included, struggle, and it's okay to get help. Firstly, I think it starts with kind of recognizing that expressing emotion and experiencing emotion is healthy. It's normal. It's natural. It can't be helped. And it's really an asset to us rather than a weakness. It describes to us or signifies to us that something's not going well. And then is it stronger to ignore that, or is it stronger to respond to that?
Right, and address it.
Yeah, really, you can't change something that you're not willing to address. So if something's causing you to feel upset, not addressing it, I think would be worse than addressing it. So it's a good thing to listen to and acknowledge your emotions to help point you in a direction of what do I need to do differently to help myself. And then just starting somewhere. You don't have to tell every person. You don't have to tell a professional if you don't want to, although it's recommended. But just start with someone that you trust. Open up, tell them how you're feeling, and ask them to listen. There's a lot of clients that I see that really the major benefit they get from counseling is just saying, I liked feeling listened to. It felt nice that someone heard what I had to say and I could finally get it off my chest. And then, of course, seeking professional help, I think, is an important step. Even if you haven't told anyone else, or even if you have, I think it's important to reach out for counseling to get the help that's available to you. It can be life-saving and life-changing, like we talked about. And another important thing is you don't have to be eloquent. It doesn't have to be fancy. You can just simply start with naming how you're feeling and go from there. Again, getting that clarity of how you're feeling can be really therapeutic in and of itself.
Do you find that with a lot of like male clients you see that they express that they feel like they aren't heard in other places in their lives?
Yes, what I've heard is that, well, firstly, what I've noticed is that they don't know how to really dig into the emotion. They'll kind of stay surface level. And I don't know if it's a comfort thing or if it's just simply they don't really do this much. They aren't accustomed to discussing how they feel. So they'll talk about events or they'll talk about turning points in the event for themselves, but not about how they feel at each point through that process.
Right.
But then, yes, they do say that they feel like they have, a lot of men will say, I don't want to burden other people with how I'm feeling. So they think that they're responsible for taking care of other people in their life and themselves. And if they were to share how they honestly felt with other people, that would cause others distress, and they don't want to do that to people. But I think they fail to see that just like they want to support others in their life, others might want to support them.
Right.
And really, it's not so much burdening them, it's actually just educating them of how you're doing, where you're at, so they can be a better support to you.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was speaking to a family member recently and they said exactly that. They go through hard times too, like a lot of stress. They've got a lot of things going on in their lives. They have 2 young kids. You know, we're all kind of being affected by inflation and the cost of living lately. And he was saying that he doesn't want to talk to his partner about how he's feeling because he just, thinks that he'd be a burden. Considering where I work, I was like, it just doesn't make sense. Like you've got to tell people who care about you what's going on.
Absolutely. And, people who kind of work in the mental health field, it seems very straightforward. If you're struggling, reach out. But for people who haven't ever been shown that or modeled that or encouraged to do that, maybe even been discouraged to do that, it can feel like a real barrier. And they can start to develop these misconceptions that if I do reach out for help, it'll actually result in something worse. I'll burden somebody else or I'll be perceived negative. When really there's a lot of upsides to sharing.
So we've brought in the idea of, other people in terms of men's mental health and how they play a role. So building these healthy relationships, whether they're with, family members or friends or coworkers, that's going to require effective communication.
Mm-hmm.
So how can men improve their communication skills to build these more meaningful connections?
If we're starting with the idea that it's important to reach out, just take that first step of sharing. Sharing does involve some other steps as well, but they're not too complicated. They're not too difficult. Just staying calm and staying assertive. That is open, direct, respectful. Just talking about your own experience versus pointing the finger or pointing the blame at somebody else. So telling someone that, I've been feeling really hurt by the fact that you're not really listening to me. And then asking if they're able to accommodate you. Ask if they're able to speak with you about what's going on. Ask if they're able to make some changes. Ask if they're able to support you in some way. And I always find that in relationship, of course, it's a two-way street. And people are much more likely to respond to you in the ways that you're hoping for if you reciprocate. So when you listen and when you empathize with people as well, it'll invite them to do the same for you. And it'll also increase your awareness of the people you're in relationship with, how they're doing, what they're struggling with too, which might therefore kind of reveal to you, hey, I'm not so different from them, or they're not so different from me. We're all kind of struggling here. And that will kind of build trust and deepen connection between you so that more sharing can happen in the future.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of vulnerability, I could see that being like feeling very difficult if that's not something you're used to. Do you have any recommendations on how to kind of ease into that or, safely kind of practice it? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I think vulnerability is kind of at the core here. It's tough for people, especially men, to be vulnerable because it kind of demonstrates or kind of signifies to other people that quote unquote weakness that we discussed earlier.
Right.
But really, vulnerability plays such a critical role in both self-awareness. We have to be vulnerable and acknowledge what's happening within ourselves. But it also is a critical component of strong relationships. Really, how could you have close relationships with people without getting close to them? And how do you get close to somebody without being vulnerable?
Right.
So what I try to do is really view vulnerability as a strength. It's really kind of like emotions as a strength. They're signals to us that show us what we can do. Vulnerability is empowering. It's a way to learn more about yourself. It can lead to more growth. It can lead to opportunities to make improvements for yourself, even or maybe especially in those areas you feel self-conscious about. It can lead to more fulfilling or deepened relationships with others, and that experience of joy in sharing life with people that you care about. And it also demonstrates to other people that you're emotionally mature and capable of maintaining relationships. So you start to invite in more people and show them that you're capable of taking this relationship with them further. And even kind of on the work side to employers, humility, which is kind of another related factor to vulnerability, is an important trait. When they talk about admitting mistakes, taking ownership, taking responsibility, it's a quality that others look for in people. So when you view vulnerability as a strength, as a way to improve yourself and your relationships, maybe it makes it a bit more enticing.
And I like that term you used earlier. You said, because, vulnerability, I don't want to say it has a negative connotation, but it certainly can get under people's skin in some way. But you said, it's a part of self-awareness. I really like that. Mm-hmm. And that seems like a very, again, like you said, empowering thing. Like if you can be vulnerable, it shows you're more self-aware.
Absolutely. And really, how far do you expect to go if you're not really aware of what you're doing and how you're doing it, how that's working out for you, what you could do differently? It's important for our own self-growth that we're cognizant of how we're feeling.
In your experience, Curtis, as a counselor, are there any kind of therapeutic approaches or techniques that you found to be really helpful with men and their particular struggles?
Yeah, I think emotion-focused or relational therapies could be useful for men. They encourage identification, understanding, and expression of emotions. So picking out what you're experiencing, why you're feeling that way, and talking about how that is impacting you. But we know that all therapies have been proven to be equally helpful. It's more important to seek out counseling rather than a specific type of therapy, because I think any form of counseling would be helpful.
We've talked about how important relationships are. What role can friends and family play in supporting men who may be experiencing mental health challenges?
Yeah, relationships are so important. And it's not just incumbent on men themselves to reach out, even though that's a very important factor. It is important for people around them to reach out to them as well. So asking questions about how men are doing in their lives, and not just general questions like, how's it going? But really asking specific ones like, how are you doing with that new move that you just went through? How are you doing with the loss of your grandmother? Making time to listen, making time to talk. So prioritizing it, not sending a text as you're on your way to something else, but maybe scheduling a time with them. Encouraging sharing, so maybe giving, reinforcing, hey, it's okay to tell me, or I'd love to know, or tell me more about that, just to let them know that there's a permissive element here, that it's okay to open up more to the person. And normalize being vulnerable. If you can share a little bit of your story, yeah, I've struggled with that before too, or, oh man, that sounds really awful. I went through something similar another time and I know how difficult that was. To again, reinforce this notion that men are not the only people who are struggling. It's okay to open up, and doing so is helpful.
Right.
And overall, just adopting a supportive and encouraging attitude towards seeking help. So after you've cultivated that atmosphere and you've scheduled the time, you've talked about it, encourage them to continue to do it by saying, wow, what if you spoke to a counselor about that? Or what if you told your so-and-so how you felt about that? To kind of encourage them to continue to share.
I've got men in my life, people that I care about. What kind of changes might I see in them if they might be starting to struggle? What kind of behavior changes in mood, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Things you might notice are irritability. If they're becoming kind of frustrated easily, angered easily, they're kind of in a bad mood, have a temper. Or the opposite, they're really withdrawn. They seem very absent. They seem like they're not expressing anything. They're giving minimal responses. They seem kind of blank. If they are spending a lot more time out of the house or a lot more time in the house, so not really engaging in activities or trying to distract from what they're going through. Yeah, loss of interest in things. If they're kind of canceling plans, not really wanting to go out, not wanting to socialize, Maybe they're starting to drink a lot more or use other substances more. So there's a lot of different things you can start to pick up on. Basically, if you're seeing a lot of deviations from their normal behavior, their normal schedule, their normal way of going about things, that will be indications, okay, something seems off here. It's a pattern, not just a one-off thing.
Right. Yeah.
And that could indicate to you that something's not going well for them.
Vulnerability is hard, and, talking about mental health, it can still carry a stigma that definitely can discourage men from reaching out for help. How can we promote mental health conversations? How can we make it more approachable and easier and inclusive?
I think that will have to happen on an individual and a system level, but it's important to create that open and non-judgmental attitude to really encourage men to discuss mental health concerns. So as I mentioned before, normalizing it by validating their experience, and that does sound really difficult, by kind of adding in your own experience, kind of showing that you've been through difficult things in the past too, and that when you shared, it was made better as a result. Opening up that conversation, kind of just being more willing to ask specific questions, more willing to ask how people are feeling on a deeper level versus just how things are going at a surface level. And using more of that gentle and compassionate language. It might be more of a grassroots thing that happens within individual relationships, in addition to kind of system level change, to make more access to counseling services or make it more covered by insurance or more accessible to the workplace. But I think just on an individual level, if we do these things, kind of show men, demonstrate to them, and help them create a new experience for themselves, realizing they're not going to be shunned or judged or experience another kind of setback if they share. In fact, they're going to be supported, they're going to be encouraged, they're going to be listened to. I think that will kind of change their perception experientially so that they're more willing to go and seek that help.
And I think this could be a whole other conversation, but I think that really starts with kids, like starting young and having those conversations and normalizing it when they're boys, right?
Absolutely.
Family dynamics and how we're raised, they can definitely have an influence on mental health. So, Curtis, how do we foster healthier family environments that promote, mental and emotional health?
It's such a wonderful question. Like you mentioned that, the change in the attitude towards men starts with how do we treat our children? How do we treat our boys?
Right.
So in the family, minimizing kind of adverse or toxic conditions, things that threaten their safety. Of course, any form of abuse, physical, psychological, sexual, emotional, etc. But even things like criticism, even things like insults, even exposure to parent conflict, these things can kind of be adverse conditions for boys growing up and for girls, of course, too. But teaching and reinforcing helpful behaviors and skills that will help children to become more effective members of society. So rewarding them or pointing out or commending them when they've done things like regulate themselves, or they've shown warmth or respect or generosity, or when they've been empathetic or affectionate towards other people, kind of encouraging those types of behaviors. Just monitoring and limiting opportunities for problematic behavior. Things like experimenting with violence or substance use or risky sexual behaviors. Maybe increasing their awareness of what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, so you can make really defined lines for them so they won't be skirting the boundaries so much. And rather than giving harsh consequences, respond with more mild negative consequences or even positive consequences to reinforce positive behaviors.
And what would that look like?
So reinforcing positive behaviors would be when maybe two siblings are playing and one sibling hits the other sibling for taking their toy. Rather than hitting them to punish them, to show them what that feels like. That might be some people's reaction. But to avoid doing things like that, and to just correct them by saying, hey, we don't hit, and that wasn't acceptable, and I would like you to apologize. And then when they've apologized, I thank you for doing that. I know it would mean a lot to me if I was hurt and others apologized to me.
Okay.
So kind of sticking with a milder negative consequence and then reinforcing what they did well that you'd like to see more of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And the last thing that families can really do is, this is a critical one, foster psychological flexibility. When we have just a narrow view of how the world works or how we're supposed to respond to the world, we discount so many other possibilities and more helpful ways of going about it. But when we're flexible, meaning we can entertain different perspectives, we can flip-flop between seeing it this way or this way or this way, it helps us to be more mindful, more aware of how we're thinking about things, and more able to switch our approach to avoid getting stuck. So we can kind of get unstuck more quickly and more effectively. The other thing it really helps with is to act according to our values. If we're aware of what we're thinking and feeling and aware of the consequence we want to see, we can start acting towards that, even when it doesn't feel like we're encouraged to act that way. It's important that we are living our lives according to what we think is true and important for ourselves.
Right. Thank you so much, Curtis. I think this is such an important topic. And I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Living Fully, a Calgary Counseling Centre podcast. Thank you for tuning in. This episode was produced by Nick here, Louisa Campos, and by me, Katherine Hurtig. A special thanks to Curtis Bader. To stay up to date on our latest episodes, be sure to subscribe. We're available in your favorite podcast app. Living Fully is a production of Calgary Counseling Centre and recorded in Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. Living Fully podcast is not a substitute or alternative for professional care or treatment. If you're in Alberta and need help, please go to calgarycounseling.com or counselingalberta.com. For help across Canada and the United States, call 211. If you are outside of Canada and the US, seek help from your general medical practitioner.